So, Dr. Victoria McCloud, welcome back to
Hi.
the Legal Brew. It's lovely to have you back on.
It's good to be here.
So, for people that haven't firstly come across you before, would you mind just giving us a very brief intro as to who you are?
Yeah, I starting at adulthood, I qualified as a barrister in 1995, and I practiced for, I don't know, 15, 20 years, something like that. And then I was lucky enough to be appointed as a judge full-time in 2010. I was part-time judge before then. And I retired recently. It's in April of 2024, and I'm now a freelance legal consultant. Just by way of background, I happen to also have been the first trans judge since uh, people may well know me from that context.
And what I would say as well, if you haven't come across the first episode that we did with Victoria, it's really, really, really interesting. We sort of delve much more into your backstory on that episode. So I'd encourage people that if you're interested in Victoria's story to go back and listen to the previous episode, because today the subject we're talking about is whistleblowing. And it's something that I know that you've had a lot of experience with, Victoria. I have myself. I've tried to blow a whistle, which we'll talk about during the course of this conversation. But I guess to get us started, whistleblowing, what's your personal experience of it? And why is it a subject that you're so passionate about?
Well, when I started being a judge, little baby judge, I was 41, 2010. Soon after I came to be a judge, the government announced, it was the coalition government at the time, they announced essentially cuts to public sector workers' pensions.
Mm-hmm.
And now the backstory is that if you're a judge, conventionally, it's supposed to be a job until you retire and you don't go back into legal practice. So it's kind of a one-way street. Since what's about to happen in this story, that's kind of changed because I think people have said, well, forget that for a game of soldiers. We shall, we'll move on. But at that point, the expectation was that it was a one-way street. So you're committed to it, and the package is, you're paid, and you get it was a pretty decent pension. But soon after I was appointed, the government announced it was going to essentially massively cut my pension based on how old I was. In other words, and this was across the board for all judges and also health workers, fire brigade, police, you name it. Now, age doesn't equate to seniority in an organisation. I was very young as a judge. Plenty of people came along after me in the years that followed who were much older than me. But this was based on age, not even experience or date of appointment or anything of that sort. And I thought, well, this seems a bit odd because if you think about women's career paths, it was quite well known. Women tended to start maybe younger but lower and then hope to rise up and had a more linear career. Maybe they were fitting around family arrangements.
Yes.
Whereas the pattern for men tended to be maybe senior barristers or senior solicitors who spent a long time in practice, coming in quite high up as a sort of big bang. So it tended to mean actually on the whole that men judges would be older demographically. And I thought, well, this seems a bit strange. And there had been advertising campaigns to recruit judges, especially women and other minorities, in recent years, which also fed the idea that probably people from minorities and women would tend to be at the younger end because they'd come along recently. So I did a freedom of information request, and I discovered that most women judges were affected by the cuts because of their age, whereas easily most judges as a whole escaped. 75% of judges escaped because most judges are actually quite old. But within that, the vast majority who were affected were women and minorities. So in other words, really, you couldn't have targeted it better if you thought about it, really, to benefit older white men. I was concerned about this. Obviously, I thought, well, this can't be right. And I raised it internally as a concern. I didn't know that I was effectively a whistleblower. I had no experience at that point of whistleblowing law. I'd hardly practiced employment law. I did some, as a barrister, but I didn't know about it. I just thought I was reporting something that couldn't really be right.
Yeah, reporting kind of an injustice, really.
Yeah, and possibly, something illegal. And I reported it within the judiciary, and I thought, well, that'll be kind of welcome because it's something the judiciary can use while they're negotiating, because this was before the law had been passed. And we'd be able to go to the government and say, actually, you shouldn't do it this way because that's probably unlawful, and use that as part of negotiation. Instead, I got myself into quite a lot of trouble as a new judge. That wasn't welcome at all because, of course, 75% of judges were going to escape. So on the face of it, it's a good deal, especially for the older white men. And I was warned I could face disciplinary proceedings if I
Oh,
pursued it.
wow.
I'd had a significant row with the most senior judge in the country. Now, this was within a few months of me being appointed. And that didn't do any good for my mental health ultimately. I did end up having a few weeks off, but I was sufficiently cross. I mean, you don't become a judge unless you care
Yeah.
about injustice. And
Yeah.
this was accident of birth. So I started talking to other judges, and a lot of people were, well, don't rock the boat, it'll all work out. But I pursued this, and it took me quite a long time, but I tracked down other judges. I mean, there were plenty of them, but they're spread around the country, other judges who were adversely affected. We sort of worked out the implications of this, and it was a vast amount of money when you look at your ultimate pension. You know, you'd lose probably half what it was worth or something. It was enormous.
Mm.
And I'd seen my parents having only just enough money in their old age, and I thought, well, you know, I don't want to end up with an inadequate pension, especially feeling I couldn't go back into legal practice. So to cut what was a long story short, I gathered together over a period of maybe 5 years a group of about 200 and something judges, basically all of whom wanted to remain anonymous after the experience I'd had. My head was over the parapet by then. Managed to locate a firm of solicitors who would work either no win, no fee, or for those of us who had home legal insurance for legal expenses, would make use of that. And we sued once the legislation had come in, and we won, and we kept winning, and the government kept appealing. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court wasn't interested. So we won and ultimately got our pensions back. That took about 10 years. And the
Wow.
effects of that are now known as the McCloud Remedy, because, of course, because the government made the mistake of appealing and appealing and appealing, it ended up affecting the whole public sector, which meant the police, the firefighters, civil service, uh, you know. And if you Google McCloud Remedy, I'm much more famous as a remedy. That'll be on my gravestone. Because actuarially, after that long, unwinding all this and compensating everyone and changing it is going to take a long time. Luckily, because I'd won a court case, I just got my pension back. It was kind of quicker. So unbeknown to me, I've been a whistleblower.
What an
Now,
interesting
yeah.
story.
And so I subsequently, and I cannot really remember how I fell into this. I think I fell into it because a judge drew my attention to it. I became a what's known as a nominated judicial office holder, which was part of the judiciary's own internal whistleblowing scheme to report concerns of illegality, unlawfulness, that sort of thing, sorts of things that fall within the Public Interest Disclosure Act. That was created because a very brave judge called Judge Gillam also sued,
Mhm.
and she sued because she said she was a whistleblower over health and safety for judges, and she was actually basically sacked. She was sent home and cut off. Uh, she said, "Well, hang on, I'm a whistleblower." The government and the judiciary said, "No, you're not. You're a judge. You can't be a whistleblower." And she put her entire life savings and her home on the line in order to
Oh,
sue.
wow.
And she lost again. But she ended up in the Supreme Court and won. Now that takes guts. And she's a really tough cookie. So she did actually win. And that meant that due to her case, not only did she have to be reinstated, but the judiciary then legally had to have an internal whistleblowing scheme. So since her case, the Gillam case, Claire Gillam, and she's a good friend of mine,
Mm.
uh, we had to introduce a whistleblowing scheme. And therefore, they looked to recruit about a dozen judges around the country who were the hotline, if you like. Our numbers were known to the judiciary, phone numbers. We could be called, and our job was to help them navigate the judiciary's internal whistleblowing scheme if they wanted to report something. So that's how I sort of got into knowing more about whistleblowing. Subsequently, I've become involved with Whistleblowers UK, and I'm actually a director of that company now. They're a non-profit company, and their role is to try to achieve improvement in law relating to whistleblowing, because listeners may well know this, especially employers, that if you make a disclosure under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, let's say someone's stealing paper clips, or maybe skiving at work, running an eBay business, ripping off the employer, that sort of thing, or worse. Maybe you've got a nurse on your ward who's killing babies. Okay, it could be really serious, or it could be lower end. You whistleblow to your employer. Now, in theory, your employer should sort it out, do the right thing. Unfortunately, the way it works is that it tends to be looked at almost as if it's a grievance. When you're not complaining, you're telling your employer something that actually should be of use to them. The problem is it then makes it an us and them. It's you and the employer, and they're dealing with your concern, actually not their concern. It should be their concern. And it's unlawful to subject a whistleblower to a detriment. However, they often are. They're often sacked, sent to Coventry, excluded, not promoted. That's the sort of thing. And if they go to the employment tribunal, they virtually never win. About 98, 99% fail.
Why
and the
is
reason
that?
for that, well, the law as it's drafted, you have to show that you were subjected to a detriment because you were whistleblowing. Now, that's very difficult because, of course, what employers will often say is, no, it had nothing to do with the whistleblowing. Actually, this person was a pain in the neck at work.
Right.
Always complaining, never fitted in, didn't work. They'll find grounds. And it's actually quite hard to show that the reason was the whistleblowing.
That's interesting.
And of course, employers will have more funds usually than employees. They can instruct lawyers to go to the employment tribunal. Typically, an employee doesn't. So, yes, you're not always exposed to a risk of legal costs in the employment tribunal, but it's often used as a threat. And you end up losing, and your health is harmed, and so on. Now, that's a problem because it leads to situations of the sort with which we are now very familiar. Let's think about the Letby case. Doctors threatened with disciplinary action, told to apologise for reporting serious harm and wrongdoing, consistent not only with their duties as employees and human beings, but actually also as professionals. So your duty as a professional can conflict as well in that sense. You may be doing the thing you have to do and be subjected to a detriment. So that system tends to mean that you have to basically be a hero if you're going to whistleblow.
It's almost like you're having to almost fight for it. There should be an easy route, shouldn't there?
Not. I mean, David and Goliath is the metaphor. Horizon is a classic example. Those people were whistleblowers, but the attitude was, you're a single isolated person, you're crooked. And they had to be heroes. And we saw from Mr. Bates in the post office that he had to be a hero, literally. Death, prison, across the board. So the system doesn't work. And I became involved with Whistleblowers UK because what we're trying to do is reform the law by introducing a whistleblowing bill. We've tried several times in the past. There is a current version that I helped to redraft in the light of kind of experience. And that would completely reform the legal system. It's based in part on the way that it's done in the United States. They have a narrower system. So it tends to be things like this, the Securities and Exchange Commission or Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. But they have a system where there is an independent office of the whistleblower, which is an organization which is not the employer,
right,
to which you can report. Now, you might think, well, another regulator, well, if this was financial misconduct at work, you could go to the FCA or some other regulator. In practice, experience shows that those regulators are kind of okay at regulating. They're not really good at dealing with whistleblowing. They'll tend to, if you do a cold call, and we have tried this, if you call a regulator and talk about whistleblowing, they'll tend to say, take legal advice. They're not going to. They're not going to.
I suppose it's quite difficult for a regulator because the scope of a whistleblower could be so broad in what they could highlight.
They need to have expertise in it.
And there could be so many different topics that one might bring up. How would a regulator go about? I think one thing that's absolutely apparent is change is needed. I had my own experience when I was a police officer in the police. Yeah, well, God, it's about 15 years ago now. I There was one particular sergeant who was just, well, he is absolutely awful what he did to me, put me through bullying for being gay, and I just saw things there that shouldn't have happened, things that were against the law, for use of powers where they shouldn't have been used. And I tried to blow the whistle internally within the police. And all of a sudden, then I was put on performance plans. And it wasn't easy. It was like you
Mm,
said, it was,
mm,
not just a case of me saying this is wrong. It was I had to fight, almost felt like I
mm,
was fighting a case to get
mm,
justice. Whereas as a junior police officer reporting against the sergeant when I'm still in
mm.
probation, it actually put my employment at risk.
It should have
And
counted. It should have counted in your favour.
yeah,
Doing the honesty. The problem, of course, is that where you have an organisation where people feel loyal.
mm,
The police are always attacked for all sorts of things, and of course, necessarily that feeling of esprit de corps is important as well. It can be healthy as well as unhealthy, and it turns unhealthy when the person doing the right thing becomes the outsider and is seen as attacking when actually they're doing it for the interest of the group.
mm,
And that's a recurring issue, of course. And so consequently, what we are trying to argue for in this bill is the creation of this body called the Office of the Whistleblower, which would specialize in knowing about whistleblowing and would also specialize in knowing what the different existing regulators do and don't do. Because at the moment, what tends to happen is that if people maybe have tried whistleblowing at work, they go to whichever regulator they think is the right one and
mm.
blow the whistle to them, they get it wrong. Within the health service alone, there are something like a dozen different channels for whistleblowing about different things, and people can't navigate it. So
It's
the regulators
probably,
themselves end up having their time wasted because it gets bounced around and then it fails because it's the wrong person. And the thing about whistleblowing is if you get it wrong, you lose the protection as the employee as well. If you follow the wrong procedure,
yeah.
so you have to be almost an expert in order to whistleblow if you're going to a regulator. So if you create the Office of the Whistleblower, that would be a small intelligence gathering operation effectively. It would use a lot of technology to receive whistleblowing reports, which can be anonymous. Its job would be to gather intelligence and assess those, weed out ones which are nonsense, pick up people who repeatedly bring rubbish ones so that they can be barred, which will help employers because employers who take it, good employers take it seriously. And of course, that means they have to go through a process each time a vexatious
Mm.
report is made. And there are people who go from employer to employer doing this and try to make money by claiming they've been. So, there are bad actors here as well. So it would take some of that strain actually off business, as well as off regulators who get the wrong people coming. But at the same time, it would have a strategic overview because it would be gathering information. So if you imagine the Horizon case, you would have had people, postmasters, telling the office of the whistleblower. They might report.
Yeah.
Now, that what would have happened is very quickly, the system would have picked up that around the country, there were several people. Now, several is enough because it's highly unlikely that around the country you're going to get unrelated people reporting the same thing. So within a very small sort of period of time, that system would have been triggered. It wouldn't have been possible to say to those postmasters, "You're the only one."
Yeah, it's actually a really good idea. The way that you're describing it, almost there being trends and patterns. It almost sounds
Yeah,
like the kind of HMRC, benefit fraud kind of tax
precisely, and tax
hotline.
as well. Yeah, and
Yeah.
what you're doing is evaluating intelligence, and then you're considering whether something has reached a threshold. The American approach talks in terms of economic impact, but also social impact of what is being reported, and it prioritizes the higher scores. So if it's about deaths in a hospital,
Mm.
let's say it's about poisoned blood supplies or something, which might affect a number of hospitals, then that would have high social impact. Equally, it could be very large financial fraud, which would score points. So it has to prioritize necessarily, but because it would pick up this intelligence, that would then mean it can direct its resources either into saying to regulators, you must investigate this and report back, or if it wishes to, actually investigate itself. And it would have statutory powers to require information. It can examine books. It can even make urgent orders, if lives are at stake. in parallel to all this, those wonderful people who are pursuing the Hillsborough law, which is the duty of candor law, we linked up with them and we liaising because the duty on a public body to tell the truth is very important. And when that's enacted, that will integrate with our system because it will mean that when the office of the whistleblower wants information, there'll be a statutory duty to give it truthfully, not just truthfully, but the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Because as we all know, you can tell the truth, but miss things out. And
Yeah.
that's what candor is. It's the truth, the whole truth. And if the employer, or it may not be an employer, because under the new system, anyone could whistleblow. Under the current system, you have to be a worker. That was what the issue in Gillam was. You don't have to be an employee, but you have to be a worker. But suppose you're in a hospital and you're a customer. Supposing you're in a hospital and you're a contractor from outside, or someone tells you and gives you information because they're too scared. Anyone will be able to be a whistleblower if they have evidence.
Well, it could be anyone who interacts with a company, couldn't it? It could be the customer. It could be a contractor. It's could be the accountant.
Anyone who wants to do the right thing will be able to do it, and if they wish, be anonymous. Now, it would actually become a criminal offence for the business to subject the whistleblower, should they know who they are, to a detriment. So it wouldn't just be able to have compensation, though that'll be available, and it can be ordered by the office of the whistleblower, and it'll be paid by the wrongdoer, but they could actually be prosecuted. And that's a very important step. And the office of the whistleblower, crucially, the office of the whistleblower, for the first time in English law, will be a body that can make orders and requirements to fix the thing being whistleblown about. Because in all of this, the entire British legal system, Public Interest Disclosure Act, it's all about damages for the employee if they whistleblow and they're submitted to a detriment. It doesn't deal with the actual thing that's being whistleblown about. So if you're reporting financial fraud, it doesn't deal with the financial fraud. If you're reporting people being killed, it doesn't deal with measures to stop that. That's completely ignored. And the office of the whistleblower, for the first time, will have powers to actually deal with it or to get regulators to look into it and deal with it. And they'll go to the right regulator.
Yeah, obviously, sorry, I cut over you there. I was going to ask, I feel that at the moment, you know, you mentioned the Lucy Letby case, you mentioned the post office case. We kind of, you know, the Harvey Weinstein, there's so many things, the Harrods thing that's come up recently. It seems like we're at a point now where if the whistleblowing organization and entity you describe is going to, you know, come about, surely this is going to be the time while the iron's hot that it happens, because it should be. It's so current at the moment. Do you think it's likely going to happen? If you was to make a prediction, do you think this will actually happen?
I think we're at the time when it should, and therefore I think it probably will. And the reason I say that is, firstly, actually, just prior to the last election, the hot news was that actually the Liberal Democrats adopted the bill as part of their policy. So at least one party actually backs it. We, as Whistleblowers UK, provide the secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group on whistleblowing. So there is a group of MPs and peers who know all about this. We have regular events and meetings. So there's a presence. We had a very successful whistleblowing awareness week in Parliament only recently, at which I and others spoke. So there's a lot of awareness. Of course, the concern is always who's going to pay for it. Well, the answer is that you go back to the American model. The wrongdoers pay for it. The funding for this actually quite small body. In the US, it's a tiny body. You know, it's measured in millions of dollars rather than like billions or anything. You don't need a lot of people because technology can be used for triage, just as the tax authorities use it. But they levy fines for wrongdoing. And in the US, the Office of the Whistleblower has funded itself many, many times over. It pays for itself. It's not even cost neutral. It actually makes money. And of course, it makes money for the economy because, particularly in things like artificial intelligence, high tech, people need confidence in our economy. And one of the areas where companies in AI are really strongly, and professionals are strongly behind this, is that we've got to be really ethical. We've got to have a reputation globally for being ethical, and we don't at the moment. I'm in
Mm.
central London at the moment, and it's often talked about that there are a lot of kind of oligarchs and there's money passing through properties, and we're a bit of a centre for that because the US has clamped down, thanks actually to whistleblowing. It can levy huge fines. It can also actually pay not only compensation but rewards to whistleblowers. So the reason it's logical is that at the moment the country's economy needs to recover, and we're strapped for cash. So why not have a system that actually pays for itself several times over?
Mm.
And has been tried and tested. And it could help boost our economy in that way. It would also, incidentally, and people may have heard that the court system is frankly on the verge of collapse, not just crime, but across the board, because it hasn't been properly funded for decades. Nobody's interested in courts. They don't think they're ever going to need a court, especially crime. They think, well, I'm not going to do anything wrong. Why should I worry? The problem is it's run down. We don't have enough judges because nobody wants to do the job anymore, perhaps because of how we're treated, and the restrictions on your lifestyle. Courts crumbling, and there are huge backlogs, not just in crime, but let's say in family, divorce,
Oh, it's
and employment.
crazy. I've had my own
Yeah.
experiences recently, and it's just, by the time the trial of the case comes up, half a decade
It's
could have gone
years. It's
by.
years. Yeah, and
Yeah.
this applies to divorce, for example, which is hugely impactful on families. And the reason for that is judges are busy doing all sorts of cases. And now, if you think about the employment tribunal, whistleblowing cases are often actually very long because there's the question of, was this actually a whistleblow? Was there reasonable grounds for the whistleblow? Was there a detriment? And was the cause of the detriment actually the whistleblow? And that goes on for a long time. These can be
Mm.
large, could be 10 days of trial. And of course, that fills up the employment tribunals. So all the people who are facing racism, sexism, unfair dismissal, and may have shorter cases that are, with real issues affecting their lives, they have delays. So this system would actually reduce delays in the employment tribunals. The right to go to the employment tribunal, if you wish, would still be there, because often people say, well, I've been facing race discrimination and I've been sacked unlawfully. And also I've been victimized by a whistleblower. So you don't want to necessarily separate them out. So they can do that. We suspect nobody's really going to want to, because it's the David and Goliath scenario. So people can go to the office of the whistleblower, and the way the system would work is that if an employment tribunal has a case which involves whistleblowing, if it's pleaded, if it's referred to, it must be reported by them to the office of the whistleblower to feed into their intelligence gathering. The office of the whistleblower may then ask for the files from the employment tribunal. It may watch the hearing. It may just record it as part of its intelligence gathering. Because if one company's got one complaint, okay. But if it keeps getting them, then it might trigger something at the AWB.
It
And
needs to happen. It needs to happen because the system at the moment of having to report and blow the whistle to the company that is ultimately responsible for the wrongdoing, the company will want to mask that, deal with it themselves, and boot the person out the door. It's not
it's seen as a
working.
reputational issue.
Yeah.
Seen as a reputational issue. And I have to say, unfortunately, that now that I've left the judiciary, that's precisely how the judicial whistleblowing system is working. It is unfortunately still seen as if it's a grievance. There's perhaps no, I mean, to be fair, judges aren't experts on whistleblowing, and yet it's administered by judges. So why should they know how to run a whistleblowing system? So it tends to be seen still as your complaint, not here I am, here's the information, do with it as you wish, please investigate, but I don't want to be involved anymore. It actually becomes your grievance, and then it becomes, yes, we've investigated, nothing to see. And it does tend to be reputation management, because for some reason the judiciary, I think, is rather over concerned about loss of face and loss of faith, when I think actually there'd be greater faith in the judiciary if we were more open and actually were visibly doing the right thing. I mean, it feeds into recent developments in the last couple of weeks that I'll be writing about in a journal shortly, where there's been a sudden clampdown on judges posting on social media at all, even about the law. There have always been restrictions, but they've got tighter and tighter and tighter. And if the impression is given that judges are silenced, they'll do one of two things. They'll either just be silent, which is not good,
Mm.
and leads to suspicions of cover-ups, or they'll just go online anonymously, which is equally no good, really, for
You
the
want
rector.
judges talking about having
Mm,
yes, there has to
mm,
be
mm,
balance,
mm,
but it just doesn't feel right a judge not being able to speak
mm,
out about issues facing the
mm,
justice
mm.
system. It just
I mean,
seems bonkers.
conventionally, of course, you wouldn't talk about a case you're involved in, or indeed an ongoing case. You don't want a judge being a judge over another judge, of course. And you don't go online saying vote Tory or something, or
Mm.
Labour or Liberal, just for balance. Other parties are available, or Green. Um, of course. And also, you don't want judges going online saying obnoxious, extreme things which suggest that they are uh, unable to hear cases fairly. Um, but conventionally, the approach was that if you're known to have strong views about something, you don't hear a case on that, and you're trusted as a professional to withdraw. And I always did. I mean, if I had a case that involved anything to do with trans people, uh, where it was relevant, uh, I wouldn't hear it. Because obviously, I'm someone who not only has benefited from uh, the reforms in the early 2000s, which gave me civil rights at all, which we may soon be losing, sadly. See my other interview.
Yes,
um,
indeed.
but, but of course, I support that. And there are people who don't support that and would take those away. So of course, I'm known to have views about that. And I also believe, for example, that I'm not a child abusing rapist or something. And,
Yeah.
so obviously I'm not going to be hearing a case that involves canvassing those sorts of issues. But it was left to us as professionals. And if we get it wrong, then there's always an appeal. I mean, that was the accountability. Now what happens is that if a judge even mentions on social media that they're a judge, actually, because you might want to be accountable. I mean, you may not want to hide, in the sense that if you say something and it's wrong, actually, it's better the public do know that you're a judge. You're not saying I'm right because I'm a judge.
Mm.
If you even mention that you're a judge, you can be disciplined publicly. It'll be in the press, and your career is over. You're not going to get promoted. And indeed, if you left the judiciary and looked for a job, you'd end up having to disclose professional misconduct. So there is basically a clampdown now on that. But that is not a healthy thing in a
No,
workplace
it doesn't feel
or for
like it.
society.
Yeah, it doesn't
Um,
feel like it.
so the idea is that this would completely replace that, and the office of the whistleblower would have a duty to help you be anonymous if that's what you want. The other side of this is that obviously, if you do suffer a detriment, they can make an order for compensation. Obviously, there can be fines for the wrongdoing, and there can be orders to put things right. Things can be acted upon urgently, but also the scope is there, and this would be under Parliament. This would be for Parliament to decide, because it's not, written into the legislation in terms of pounds and pence. But it would be open to Parliament to decide that it wishes to acknowledge, by way of an equitable payment of money, to acknowledge the right doing that's been done by the whistleblower. A bit like giving a medal, if you like, to say,
Oh.
actually, you've done the right thing. You have saved the state X, or you've saved lives, you've improved something, you have done the right thing, and to actually pay them money. In the US, people actually can be paid a great deal of money. That may not be the British way, but the point is, we need to address this idea that if you're a whistleblower, you're a stool pigeon, you're a snitch. Whereas actually,
Yeah.
you're doing us all a favour. So the power would be there to compensate or reward, however you want to put it, but make an equitable and just payment to acknowledge the good that person has done for society. Because actually, fraud is, generally speaking, a fraud on all of us, because it feeds into taxes, it feeds on how services don't work properly. It actually affects us all, and we do have a very large, I think, lurking wrongdoing and fraud problem, which will become apparent if the office of the whistleblower starts, because ordinary people can report it. They can do it anonymously, can do it with a greater degree of safety. I'm afraid suddenly we would get a clearer intelligence picture, and there might be a bit of shock to start with. But once we've faced that, we can prioritize the biggest and work our way down. And it would do an immense amount to, I think, improve confidence in our economy, and indeed save the taxpayer a
Mm.
lot of money. So we're hoping that the Labour government, and I was talking with others to the previous government and to the then opposition, because we're not political, we're pursuing change in law. Obviously, we're talking to MPs across both sides. The all-party parliamentary group, as its name suggests, is all-party. There's a lot of support across the board. It isn't Labour policy. However, they have recently said that they're actually going to look at it again and evaluate the arguments for it. It meshes perfectly with something they have adopted, which is the Hillsborough law, the duty of candour. It effectively gives teeth to the duty of candour. The Hillsborough law basically says if there's a public body that is investigating, such as the Hillsborough disaster, you, the public authority, the police, you actually have to be completely frank and truthful, which didn't happen in Hillsborough, as we all know the story. But there's no more teeth than that. Our bill has been redrafted partly to mesh with theirs, and therefore it melds very well with the way the bill that the government does support will work. And we've worked together with the wonderful team at the dealing with the Hillsborough law. And I think, there's a sense that good things here could be done, not only, for the country, but in the memory of those who died as well. So there is a lot more hope now that this will in fact ride up the agenda and be dealt with. It's a bit of a no-brainer, I have to say.
It feels like that. It feels like that.
It's free money. It's free money for the government.
Yeah, well, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are going to be surprised that this isn't a thing or it doesn't exist already, given the fact that what you're describing, in a sense, is an anonymous tip-off line in order to report criminality.
Yeah, it certainly can be.
And it pays for itself. That's
I know,
the beauty of it.
And the Americans have just gone, wow.
Yeah.
And that's actually why they pay very large rewards in America, because they've got so much money that actually they've realized that if you pay people a lot of money, they actually report more. And they're running out of corruption. And as a result of this, unfortunately, money launderers, all that, they do it here.
Yeah.
And the kicker here, though, is that under the American system, if you are aware of wrongdoing and the wrongdoing has a connection with the United States, so let's say it's financial. Now, just about any money at some point passes through the US because the banking systems and the computers and all that, it touches the US. If it touches the US, they claim jurisdiction. So you can whistleblow in the US. If you're right, the British bank gets a huge fine. It has to pay the American Treasury, so the American taxpayer gets the benefit, and you, the British person, could actually get a very large reward. So at the moment, there's no incentive to whistleblow in Britain. And we're giving money by not having this ourselves. We're literally allowing the Americans to outcompete us in law enforcement and take our money, or our bank's money.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And British banks have been fined billions. Nobody really talks about this, but it's going over there. We need to compete on that front.
We do.
And come on, bring it, repatriate. Make law enforcement great again. So that's another reason why it's a no-brainer. It makes us look a bit silly, frankly, not having a system like this.
Victoria, having you on is always so fascinating. I don't think you can pack more into this. I think it's been. I think you've really covered that well, and it's been very interesting because I didn't know a hell of a lot of what you mentioned, and I wish you the very best. Getting that through because it needs to happen. If people want to support the cause, what can they do to get behind this to help you?
Well, first of all, the website is WB UK. That's easy to find.
Very easy to find.
Whistleblowers UK. The bill is obviously available online. Above all else, if you care about it, write to your MP. Ask them to join the all-party parliamentary group on whistleblowing, or at least attend it. Ask them to support the whistleblowing bill. It hasn't been introduced. We need a slot. We need a private member's bill slot to do it. It'll happen again. It will happen. It could be in the House of Lords or the House of Commons. But just let it be known that actually you've heard about this and you think it's a good idea. And actually, please, employers, do that as well, because the employers actually, most of the time, they want to do the right thing. It's actually quite difficult to do the right thing because people often whistleblow about things wrongly, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff. But remember, as an employer, you stand to gain as well, because the new system wouldn't just be there to hit employers. It would actually pick up patterns of recurring vexatious nuisance reports and bar them. And that should be quite a significant incentive. I've been asked at events talking about this, well, what's it? Aren't you just bashing employers? No, it's actually not. It's about improving the whole system. And because it's intelligence driven, we can also have trust-based regulation. So if you're a good employer and you deal with whistleblowing internally and regulatory things properly, you're less likely to be subject to an Office of Whistleblowing investigation
Well,
when
yes.
reports come in.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
that over time, the resources of the Office of the Whistleblower will be focused on the bad apples, not the good
Mm,
ones. If you're a decent employer, you're not going to get so much focus because you are trusted to deal with it. I mean, it's trust but verify. But as long as you keep dealing with things properly, they're not going to be on your back. That's true, I think, with the revenue. It's true actually with a lot of government agencies. And it's only where it's necessary that the Office of the Whistleblower would act. It would be very lean and pay for itself. So, but if you support this, please post about it, speak to your member of parliament, write to your member of parliament, tell them to join the all-party parliamentary group on whistleblowing. Just call it whistleblowing and support the whistleblowing bill. It's right for the country, I think.
I agree. I think I'm behind it. So, Victoria, thank you so
It's been
much.
brilliant. It's lovely
It's
to do this
been
again.
lovely to talk to you on a subject, and the passion just really shines through on this. If you also want to get in contact, Victoria's on LinkedIn. We'll be posting this there. Do you leave your comments underneath as well? And once again, a big thank you. Thank you for
Thank
coming on to
you.
the
Well,
Legal
I hope we can
Brew.
speak again soon. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.